Cryptographic protocols are used for encrypting Wi-Fi connections, for encrypting network connections. We're going to talk about a few of those today. Wi-Fi Protected Access, or WPA, was designed as an interim replacement for WEP, or Wired Equivalent Privacy. Wired Equivalent Privacy was one of the earliest Wi-Fi encryption mechanisms, and there were many security flaws discovered within WEP. First off, the key size used in WEP was very small, which made it very easily cracked using brute force attacks. So WPA was developed as a replacement. WPA has security vulnerabilities of its own, though, and it was eventually replaced with WPA2. But the vulnerabilities within WPA include susceptibility to password crackers, offline brute force attacks where attackers will sniff maybe a password hash and then conduct an offline brute force attack against that hash, or sniff that hash by capturing packets en route. So the attacker will sniff the authentication information sent over a wireless connection, for example, and then retrieve that hash and then conduct brute force attacks against that hash. And due to the security flaws of WPA, it's very easy for attackers to conduct those brute force attacks against those hashes offline. Now, when I say conducting a brute force attack, I mean using a password cracking software on the user's, on the attacker's device. We went over early in the course, in the Security Plus course on Cybercraft, we over some tools that could be used for this, particularly within Kali Linux. Let's take a look at one of those just as an example. So let's open up our Kali Linux machine. And take a look at some of the password cracking utilities that can be used to conduct attacks against WPA. So as always with Kali Linux, if you look in the top left, you can see different types of attack methodologies, and the utilities within Kali Linux are organized in such a way. And we talked about John the Ripper, how John the Ripper can be used to conduct attacks against password hashes. But there's many different types of attacks or different utilities you can use once you've intercepted that password hash using something like Wireshark. Then you can retrieve the hash and then conduct attacks on the hash, brute force attacks, and whatnot. So, just an example of some of the tools and how an attacker would actually go about conducting that password hash attacks. So, like we said, Wi-Fi Protected Access. WPA follows 802.1x, wireless set of standards, and uses a pre-shared key for access control with Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, or TKIP, for encryption. We're talking about KeyKIP just now. Later versions of WPA, when WPA was replaced with WPA2, WPA began to use AES for encryption and became much more secure. So Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, this is an older type of encryption protocol used in the 802.1x wireless standard. It was used by WPA, and again, when WPA was implemented to replace WEP, TKIP was adopted as the encryption protocol. The advantage with using TKIP was that users could implement TKIP using a firmware update. They didn't need to replace the hardware they already had, so it became a very popular, if temporary, solution. TKIP worked by adding some randomness to the encryption process by varying the lengths of the initialization vectors used with the encryption key, and that was one of the big problems with WET. The initialization vector was very small, which allowed for attacks on the keys. So TKIP addressed that security vulnerability directly by adding randomness to the initialization vector. And although it added some good security to WPA, ultimately both of these technologies, WPA and TKIP, were phased out. Now we use Wi-Fi Protected Access 2, or WPA2. And again, this follows the 802.1x wireless standard, uses a pre-shared key for access control, and now it uses CCMP, which we'll talk about in a moment. WPA2 provides very good protection against most attacks. It's considered a very secure Wi-Fi security protocol. So cipher block chaining message authentication protocol, or CCMP, uses cipher block chaining as a cipher. Remember, cipher block chaining will encrypt data in blocks, okay? And each block will rely on the encryption of the previous block, and those blocks are encrypted in a series or a chain. So cipher block chaining uses AES, which means CCMP uses AES, an advanced encryption standard. AES is a very strong encryption standard, which makes CCMP and WPA2 very secure methods of securing wireless communication. The strength of CCMP and AES is one of the reasons why WPA2 is so successful and seen as such a strong wireless standard. Pre-shared key mode, or PSK mode, is one of the several different types of modes that wireless security protocols can operate in. So a pre-shared key uses a key that's already shared, or that users already have knowledge of, to govern Wi-Fi access. Most of the times this is just a password. So the Wi-Fi password is a form of a key. Remember, passwords are keys. And keys can be other things as well, but a password can also be a key. So if you share a Wi-Fi password with somebody, say in your house, or at the workplace, you give somebody the Wi-Fi password to get onto the office Wi-Fi, that's a pre-shared key method. And this is PSK mode, or pre-shared key mode, is used for the vast majority of Wi-Fi networks. Enterprise mode, this is where you'd have like a large organization, would grant access to users only after they've authenticated with a set of credentials. That's going to be like a username and password. Okay, so it's not just a password here. You're authenticating the user. You're identifying the user through their username, and you're forcing the user to provide a set of credentials, most likely a password, but it could be maybe a PIN with a CAC card, or a common access card, or an ID badge, maybe a biometric scanner with a fingerprint, or maybe an iris scanner, however your organization chooses to do their authentication. Enterprise mode requires some additional hardware. It'll require an authentication device like a radius or diameter server, and many large organizations use enterprise mode. The U.S. federal government would use enterprise mode with those common access cards, or those PIV cards. And open mode means that there's no security on the Wi-Fi network. So open mode you'll find in coffee shops a lot of times. You'll find just in places that businesses that want to attract people to use their place of business as a hangout spot. Well, at least you used to before our current situation. But those are some different Wi-Fi encryption methods and security methods. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope you got something out of today's presentation or study session. Again, if you have any questions, email info@cybercrafttraining.com. And if you're interested in taking our Security Plus course, please check the link in the description. Thanks a lot.